Welcome to all delegates and friends assembled here. Uh, this session is exclusively dealing with media, and we have a reference point that is Western media and how the global South, when we say global South, we make a reference to countries, developing countries, underdeveloped countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia generally, how they look upon the media, international media, and how the Western media, particularly the print and electronic media, now that we have new media plus social media, how they are controlling the global information system. And it is through this global control over the global information system that we have the circuits of control in other areas also, not only in media. Say, for example, in culture, in political economy, in international trade, everywhere you have the circuits of control through international media. And who is controlling what is very important today. Way back in the 1970s, there was a call for rethinking international information order, wherein we need people from Africa to speak on behalf of Africa and their voices to be heard, people from Asia to be heard from the point of view of their media, and like that. But unfortunately, in the 70s and 80s, the estimates shown that more than 90% of the global circuits of news were controlled by a handful of half a dozen news agencies. They control the entire information system in such a manner that the plus and minus news, or you may call it a positive and negative news from the global South, are not effectively articulated in such a manner that you have a balanced flow of communication. The net result is that most of these global South countries are unable to make their presence felt across the international circuits. And thereby, you have a kind of a case for an alternate international information system. And that, in fact, came with the intervention of UNESCO way back in the 1970s and subsequently in the 1980s. A commission was appointed to examine this international information order, and finally, a report was submitted under the chairmanship of Sean McGrath. And you would have heard about this wonderful report presented by Sean McGrath. And the title of the volume is called, what is it called? Many Voices, One World. That's a very popular report. But nobody remembers that there was a report like this. And even the media in the global South are not aware of that. This Many Voices, One World report is not seen anywhere in this world. So what I'm saying is that we have today the scenario being multiplied with additional control exercised by the news media through new forms of circuits. Say, for example, now that we have the internet age, had dawned since 1980s or early 1990s, controlling the international media, and thereby you have again a very complex scenario of even the new media and social media being controlled by the West. Knowingly or unknowingly, we get trapped into their news coverage, news biases, and all kinds of things. And today, even the reports that emerge from the global South are not properly articulated. We have the classical instance of how the carnage or the genocide in Gaza is not reported globally. And whoever speaks of this Gaza genocide will be treated very badly in international media. That is one aspect. The second aspect is that the journalists across this world are undergoing a kind of a phase of fundamental transformation. And we are moving to the world. The last session was on ChatGPT. The AI controlled information system will be put in place in such a manner that journalists will disappear from the world map of media sooner or later. That's a fear that everyone keeps in mind. This is the second order. The third thing is that not everything is fine with the global south media. And we have the same scenario of the events being distorted and the events being colored and biased because of the intervention of authoritarian systems in place. We know how the government of India has treated the BBC documentary, India Modi Years or Modi Time. And we have innumerable instances. So what is important is that whether we have a case for an alternative media system, fearing that there is this global Western media controlling everything, even the events and developments of the global South. So we will start with, we have two very prominent journalists with us. And I do not know whether we can, strictly speaking, we can call them as journalists. They are partly journalists as well as academics in a different sense, because they have a very good background in academic, what we call as engagements, both Anjan and Stanley Johny. Anjan has been working across this world, particularly in the global south countries like Africa and Latin America. He has an extremely wider and very complex experience in terms of handling media, particularly the way the news circuits are polluting events and developments across the countries in Africa and Latin America. And Johny, Stanley Johny, everyone knows that he is not only an international affairs editor of the Hindu, he has also been a very a regular speaker and a kind of social critique of events on developments in not only in West Asia and Central Asia or other countries, but also on events related to media and other things. So we will start with, we have the first round going with each presentation in terms of 10 minutes presentation. Then we will come back to the second round. The third round will be exclusively for the audience. So we will start with Anjan. Anjan, you have been working in Central Africa and also in Rwanda and Congo more specifically. And you have been reporting from these countries regularly, telling that these countries are undergoing a kind of a phase of human survival crisis in terms of the kind of agonies, the kind of sufferings of these people because of civil war, because of authoritarian regimes in place, and so on and so forth. And also in Mexico, in Latin America, now that you are in Mexico, you have the case of how indigenous communities are being, I don't know whether we can use this word, used. They are actually appropriated for global corporations for their plunder in one way or other. But these things are not reported, these things are not shown anywhere. And people are not aware of what is happening in Africa, people are not aware of what is happening in Latin America and other things. Why is that this ignorance? Is it a kind of a problem of the Western media, or it's a part of the crisis in both the global south and the global north? How do you look at the way things are reported from these countries? We'll start with that.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. So actually this question of the problems with the Western media, my last 20 years, my whole career has been dedicated to working in that space, filling that gap. The questions that the places that I report on, the conflicts, I mostly report on conflict and on war and some dictatorships. mostly are places and situations that I feel should be more present in the international media, but they're not. So the challenge that excites me is trying to get these stories from Congo or from indigenous communities in Mexico into the international media. So last year, for example, I spoke at TED. I gave a TED talk about my reporting in Mexican indigenous communities who are fighting drone wars and real conflicts, and they're not even reported. These wars are not even reported in the Mexican media. So the problem is actually quite widespread. I'm sure the Indian media itself has some blind spots about situations within India. So every media has its blind spots. So I've tried to work in the blind spots of the international media. Previous year, I wrote a piece about Rwanda. It was on the front page of the New York Times. So all these media, I write for the BBC. So all these media have, biases, prejudices, blind spots. I try to fill them. The challenge that excites me is trying to convince an editor at the New York Times or at TED or at the BBC that these stories are important and should be covered. So I try to change their thinking. And so it's quite difficult work sometimes, but it's what excites me. Now to your question, why? I think the problem is twofold. It's both with the international media and with the global south. With international media, I did a PhD on this topic. The PhD sort of explained or discovered how the international media has colonial systems, or the structure of the international media is colonial in nature. It's still biased, it's still prejudiced. This system of foreign correspondents being sent from global capitals like New York and London to report on the global south or peripheries of the world is a very colonial system. Where in colonial times they extracted natural resources and transformed them back in their countries. Now the same process happens with extracting information and transforming it and sending it back to the countries. The international correspondents win all the prizes, get most of the financial rewards, but the actual people doing the reporting, say in India or in Congo, are local reporters who've been following these stories for a long time. They get very little financial reward, they get very little credit for their work. So there are inherent biases. That said, I think to answer your question, we are now at a time when the global south is rising. The Indian economy is rising, Nigerian economy is rising, Kenyan, China. And so I think there's less and less of an excuse for media in countries like India to keep complaining about Western coverage. When we have more and more, we're more capable of deploying the resources to cover the world. So for example, last night I arrived over here, and in my hotel room I did an interview about the Congo war, which has flared up in the last few weeks. I did an interview for Nigerian media, and they asked me the same question, why isn't the Congo war, so the Congo war, just to give you some context, 6 million people have been killed in this Congo war. It's the deadliest war since World War II. And yet it doesn't make the front pages of international media. So this is a question that interested me when I was a student. I was a student in the US. I grew up here, but I was a student in the US, and I saw a little article about Congo in the middle of the New York Times at the bottom of the page saying 4 million people had died back then. And I didn't understand why this was not on the front page. So I bought a one-way ticket and I went to Congo and I became a reporter, and I trying to understand why these stories, despite affecting so many millions of people, don't make the front page. And so I was glad to see last night, for example, that Nigerian media are taking an interest. Some producer found me, found 2 other global south actors, and we were a panel of 3 reporting on the Congo war, which Rwanda has invaded Congo again. And the last time this happened was in 1996 and 1998, and it sparked this 3-4 decade war that has now killed 6 million people. So it's a big deal. Rwanda has invaded again. There's this fear that the war might spark all over again. Rwanda might take over Congo. It's a huge country and a huge war, and millions of people's lives are at stake. And so it deserves attention. And so I think, to summarize, I think the question I would ask is, what can we do for the global south to provide more coverage? Because I think as Indians or as Nigerians, we will naturally give greater value and greater importance to the lives of people in our neighboring countries. And we can't keep expecting and complaining about the West's inability to do that. And so I'll just end with, I guess, I'm involved in a couple of initiatives to start media platforms and organizations from the global south with a greater emphasis on the global south, not excluding the global north, but trying to provide more equitable coverage, because we don't have such a platform in the world today. Al Jazeera, to some extent, provides it. but it also has its own blind spots. So can we create a truly global media platform that values people's lives equitably around the world? That is a question. That's a big gap in the world today.
This Nigerian case is very interesting, and when nearly 2026 Indian seafarers were arrested and they were stranded, actually stranded, but later on they were arrested on charges of oil theft. The entire Nigerian media, in fact, provided a kind of a distorted picture of the entire episode in such a manner that it caters to the interest of the ruling class. That shows that even the global media and the global south, you cannot trust. Even if you say that there is a south-south cooperation, you don't find like that. And it's only after the intervention in the Nigerian court and with a huge amount of money that we had to deposit that these people were released. It was a very fake case of oil theft from the company and also for Indian seafarers. And they were actually fined for nothing. That is one story, but nobody reported in India. Not many international media reported this, but the entire story was in such a way that Indian seafarers are joining for this oil theft of a few companies and like that. That's one point. And we'll come back to Stanley Johny. Stanley Johny has been a very popular figure here in India, in South India. We know each other for quite a long time. He is basically from academics, but has taken an enormous interest in writing on international affairs, being the editor of international affairs of the Hindu. He has been not only writing but visiting several countries and also reflecting on very critical events of the world. I think his latest work, The Original Sin, you would have seen it in the book fair, and also I think it is being sold here. It's one of the most wanted works of international affairs recently, and this a region of West Asia, Middle East or North Africa has been a very sensitive region in international affairs, and how the events are reported from that particular region, how these events are reported in the media of the global south and in the international media is very important. And we have seen a number of cases of how the most recent incidents of, not incidents, genocidal proportion of these Gaza killings have been reported in international media, and how the Al Jazeera version and the BBC version have been different. BBC, we assumed that over a period of time, BBC has been very, very generous in terms of producing stories of one kind and another. But we have seen that over a period of time, even BBC has been careful enough to to do enough coverage of the actual event, what's happening in the Gaza and other areas like that. Do you think that Al Jazeera is popularly known as an agency of the Arab world and like that? But they are not. I'm sure that the Arab countries are not generally welcoming Al Jazeera in that way, because many countries are afraid of Al Jazeera doing their work in terms of promoting people's movements across this world. Now, one reason why that the Arab Spring was brought to an end was that, and they all feared that Al Jazeera was behind everything like that. So the two things are very important. The first thing is that whether the reports or the events from the West Asian region are properly reported, properly reflected in the media of both the international Western media as well as in the media of the global South. The second point is whether the media from the global South, say for example from a country like Qatar, like Al Jazeera, can play the kind of role that it is expected to play on behalf of the entire global South. These are the general questions first, and we'll come back to that later. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you, sir, and thanks everybody for coming here. It's an honor to be here. Anjan is a friend. This is the second LitFest stage we are sharing. Last time I was asking questions. And Professor Seethi is my guru. He taught me international relations back in 2002. So I'm very honored to be here, and thank you very much. So to answer the question, see, I'll give you an example. I'm sure that you might be remembering the ICC arrest warrant against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his former defense minister Yoav Gallant. And everybody reported this event. And Washington Post had written an editorial. You can go read the editorial. And in the editorial, the newspaper argued that ICC should not waste its resources chasing the Israeli Prime Minister. Rather than they should focus on getting the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Because there was an arrest warrant against President Putin as well. That's fine. I mean, there was an arrest warrant against President Putin. Russians invaded Ukraine. No problem about that. But imagine the audacity of a newspaper, which is a serious newspaper, to write an editorial saying that the ICC should not waste its resources chasing a prime minister who has been accused of committing genocide in Gaza. So this is, I think, this is the best example of the double standard you see in the international media when it comes to reporting different events. And I always use these two, events like Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Israel's occupation and continuing attacks on both Gaza and the West Bank as an example to understand how the Western media approach, how the international media in general approaches these incidents. Because if you read about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you can see the moral anger. In Economist, how many cover stories are there in Economist? The same Economist which supported America's invasion of Iraq, the same Economist which supported America's invasion of Libya, the same newspaper which wanted America to hit hard Bashar al-Assad of Syria, they had a cover, putting Bashar's picture on the cover, hit him hard. The same Economist had basically, was very, very morally anger and unsettled about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Again, that's fine. But you read about the way the Gaza war, Israel's invasion of Gaza, is being portrayed by these media organizations. Economist is one example, New York Times is another example. If you read BBC again, Palestinians die. I mean, as if they died of something else. This is, there is a relentless Israeli bombing on Gaza, and you will see the BBC headline that 8 Palestinians die in clashes. That's one example. And then, another example is that, remember when the Israelis sent troops to Lebanon, basically when the Lebanese invasion, the latest Lebanese invasion began in October, the New York Times page 1 headline was that Israel sends troops to Lebanon as if it's a picnic. This is a violation of the sovereignty of Lebanon. This is an outright invasion. But you see the headline is Israel sends troops to Lebanon. So, there are multiple examples you will find in international media that basically, give us an idea about how these incidents are being covered. And I think, when it comes to Al Jazeera, I mean, my point is that you look at what happened in Gaza. What happened in Gaza was, I would say, one of the most brutal massacres of the 21st century. You look at the sheer numbers, you will have different narratives. And 47,000 people were killed. 100,000 people have been injured. And almost the entire population of Gaza has been displaced. That's 2.3 million people, right? And you look how it's being reported in international media. I would argue that the attention which it requires, it hasn't got that in the international media. And compared to these media organizations, I would say Al Jazeera is doing, at least Al Jazeera is doing its bit to bringing what is happening in Gaza or what is happening in West Bank to the international attention.
Thank you. I think when this relationship between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, UAE and Qatar was broken, one of the main points was that you should stop Al Jazeera working, reporting on events like that. Because they're afraid of the Arab countries, the regimes are afraid of Al Jazeera playing a role of as popular, representing popular aspirations and like that. And they're not in that sense very, very comfortable in terms of entertaining media like that. Generally, the Arab countries' media, I think the whole media in the Arab world are not in that sense quite comfortable in terms of dealing with people's issues. The same is the case with Mexico. You have pointed out the case, how Mexican media suppressed the events of the struggles of the indigenous communities there and so on and so forth. So do you think that having worked with BBC, New York Times and several international agencies, what sort of challenges that you faced in terms of After providing all these details to the editorial desk, when these things don't appear in the next day in the, in the newspaper, how did you feel and what sort of justification that they would have offered? And were there such instances in your career where your reporting was not properly appreciated, was not properly represented in the next day's newspaper, and so on so on? How did you respond there?
Um, so yes, so my last book is about the Central African Republic, and so when I asked magazine editors to send me to the Central African Republic, they asked me which Central African Republic. You know, they didn't even know. So there's the first level is ignorance. The worldview is such that they pay attention to certain parts of the world, certain countries, certain conflicts, certain situations, and when I suggest something that's in their blind spot, it's in their blind spot to such a degree that they don't even know that the country exists, that there is a country named Central African Republic. They're not aware, you know. So that's the first level. Then I would say that, so that's on the Western side. On the global South side, I've also faced similar problems. An example is I presented a TV show about India. It's a 4-part TV show some years ago. And it came out well. It was well received. There was, you know, the critics were positive about it. So we pitched to the same. It was for Channel News Asia, the Singapore's national TV channel. They have a lot of resources. The production value is very high. So we pitched them. They asked us, "Can you do another show?" So we pitched them U.S. Can we go to the U.S. and do? The show was called Deciphering India, and so we said, "Can we do Deciphering America?" And they said, why don't you do Indians in America? And we said, no, we want to do America. They said, how about Asian tycoons in America? And we said, no, we want to do America. And it was very difficult to convince the editor that we had the resources and the team and the perspective to report definitively on the US. In the same way that the US reporters report on India or Southeast Asia or China, it was a problem of confidence. The editor in Singapore didn't believe that we had the authority, that we had the skills to provide a respectable perspective on the US. So they wanted us to narrow our perspective to Indians or Asian tycoons or something more local. And so that's a real problem on the other side, you know, that we have to fight. No, they don't have the confidence. I think this is a colonial problem, post-colonial problem. They don't have the confidence to report on the world in the same way. So I think that's another step that needs to be broached, and I think we're getting there. But yeah, I guess these are sort of two examples, you know, of how my work has been received. Or for example, when I've reported on Rwanda, the dictator there's a dictatorship. I was often asked in Western media, is it really dictatorship? You know, because many Western countries have alliances with Rwanda, and they have geopolitical interests. And so they've respected the Rwandan president's insistence that it should not be called a dictatorship. He holds elections in which he wins by 99%, but still he wants it to be called a democracy. And so I've had to fight those battles in publishing, in the media, to put forward my, you know, my articles or my books. And I don't take it as, it's not been, to answer your question about how I've received it, for me, I don't take it as too much of a disappointment. For me, it's a challenge, because I know what I've reported, I know where I've reported from, and I'm quite sure of my perspectives. So the challenge then becomes, how can I somehow circumvent the editorial power structures and get this news into the media? And that's what's excited me.
Stanley, I have another related question. I think you had studied Edward Said, and he had written a book in the early 1980s covering Islam. That was about how international media reported on the events in Iran after the Iranian revolution, like that. In fact, that was one of the three important books of Edward Said, like on Palestine and also Orientalism. In terms of production of knowledge, I think the way the international media, I think most of these scholars in international affairs and also in political science and other disciplines, they rely on newspapers and magazines for day-to-day events and like that. So it's quite natural that the scholars get affected. They get a biased and prejudiced view of things, how things are reported and like that. Even on issues related to the area of West Asia, including the, Islam and other things like that. Do you think that over a period of time, this tendency to um, either to over exaggerate the events in these countries, like in Iran, or that you have under exaggeration or underestimation or under reporting of these events? Is that happening? Or if that is so, that this covering is still a process of covering in the sense that it has a double meaning. You are covering up and also you are covering. So, how do you look at this scenario of the events emerging from the West Asian countries, particularly in the context of the developments in Syria, in Turkey, and other areas? I think people are not aware of what is really happening, particularly whether the regimes in power, they are really whether people's representative or agents of some other countries or agencies of certain types of certain brands of religion, and people are not aware of all these things like that. How do you clarify when you write these reports in Hindu or international media, whether you are expected to clarify each and every point so that people don't get confused? That's partly an academic question, but partly your professional question.
So in my personal experience, what we try to do when we do something, whether I am writing something or my colleagues try to write something on international affairs, we also try to explain the conflicts, the actors, the jargons, the historical context, even the ideological narratives. We try to at least bring those narratives in so that the article will offer a larger comprehensive picture to the reader. And we also try to do one of the problems. Yeah.
I will just intervene
Yeah.
to remind you how Hamas was projected and portrayed. Whether it was a ruling dispensation in Gaza,
Yeah.
but it was a terrorist organization declared by United States, European countries, and a few other countries.
And Israel, yeah.
But countries like India have been declared as a. So this is a question that comes to my mind of many scholars also.
Yeah.
Whether it is a terrorist organization or it is a ruling dispensation or it is an agent of some other country like that.
So yeah, so I can. So in the case of Hamas, Hamas is a ruling dispensation in Gaza, but at the same time, this is not an internationally recognized government. Gaza is only a part of the Palestinian territories. West Bank has a different administration. And Hamas is being designated as a terrorist organization by Israel, European Union, and the United States, etc., etc. It is basically an Islamist militant organization. So that is one thing. And India, at least the official, the MEA hasn't designated Hamas as a terrorist organization, and a vast majority of countries in global south hasn't officially recognized Hamas as a terrorist organization. And I can give you the reasoning of these countries. See, Hamas has used terror as a means. Everybody knows that. Hamas has used suicide bombings in early 2000s, in 1990s. So it has used terror as a means. So if you are going by the book definition of an organization that uses terror as a means, you can call Hamas a terrorist organization. But you have to use the same argument for states as well, because if you refer to the kind of violence the Israeli state is carrying out, what are you going to call it? Nobody is going to call. I mean, at least if you look at it from an international point of view, no country is going to designate Israel as a terrorist state, right? So this is here, it is actually a one-sided designation, even if you call Hamas a terrorist organization. And then the second point is that if you are looking at a solution to the Palestinian crisis, Palestinian question, who are the main actors here? On the one side, you have the state of Israel, that's fine. And on the other side, you have different actors on the Palestinian side. You have the PFLP, you have the Fatah party, you have the PLO in general, you have Hamas, you have Islamic State. And if you want to find a solution at the end of the day, what you need is to bring all these parties together, including the state of Israel, and initiate a peace process. And this is what the international community did in the 1990s, because before the 1990s, the PLO was also designated as a terrorist organization. Menachem Begin called PLO the murderous anti-Semites. And the same Israel recognized the PLO as the official representative of the Palestinian people. And the PLO, which until 1990 said that they wanted to liberate the whole of Palestine from the river to the sea, and the PLO settled for 23% of the Palestinian territories, saying that they want a state based on the 1967 border, which is 23% of historical Palestine. So you look at both sides had made compromise, concessions, to get to reach at least where the Oslo agreement was signed. But Oslo collapsed, that's a different matter. But my point of view is that here Hamas, at the end of the day, yes, it's an organization that uses terror, you can designate it, but at the end of the day, if you are looking at a long-term solution, you need to bring both sides together. So I think that's one of the reasons that many countries in the global south, including India, continue to look at Hamas. They might be critical of Hamas's ideology, I myself am, they might be critical of Hamas's means, but at the same time, they see Hamas as a political entity. Because the last time you had elections in the Palestinian territories in 2006, Hamas was the winner. And Hamas formed a government. And Hamas's government was dissolved by Abu Mazen in West Bank because European countries, the United States and Israel said that they would not deal with a government headed by Hamas, an elected government headed by Hamas. So Abu Mazen dissolved the government, and the dissolution of the government in Gaza is what pushed, dissolution of the government in Ramallah in the West Bank is what pushed Hamas to Gaza. So Hamas would take over Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority would retain their control over the West Bank. And then, I mean, if you look at what happened on October 7, basically ever since 2005, Hamas has been in control of Gaza, and Gaza is being blockaded by Israel and Egypt. One crossing Egypt, Rafah crossing, and the rest of Gaza is being blockaded by the Israelis. So you can see, I mean, this is a very tricky question, but at the same time, I think most countries in the global south, and by and large the international community, look at Hamas, despite being critical of the means they use, they look at Hamas as, as an important Palestinian entity who should be taken into consideration if you want to make a deal in the future. Even if you look at the ceasefire, when Netanyahu launched the war, he said his objective was to crush Hamas. You look at all the Israeli ministers, they all said they wanted to destroy Hamas, right? And they wanted to destroy Hamas, they wanted to get the hostages out through force. And they launched the war on October 8 after Hamas's October 7 attack, which killed 1,200 people in Israel. And after 15 months of the war, Israel had to cut a deal with Hamas. They can say that we don't hold direct negotiations with Hamas, but that's only a technical explanation. At the end of the day, under the mediation of the Egyptians, the Qataris and the Americans, Israel and Hamas talked to each other. They reached an agreement, and as part of that agreement, there is now a ceasefire, at least in the first phase, and Israel is releasing 30 Palestinian security prisoners in return for every one hostage that Hamas is being released. That is at least the terms of the agreement. So, despite the designations or whatever you would like to call, what we see is that if you want peace, you need to make both sides talk to each other. So I think it's important that instead of calling names, instead of rushing to designate the actors, the larger focus should be on bringing the actors together to find a solution to the crisis.
The same thing is related to people's struggles in Africa and also in Latin America. You will have to categorize, or you will have to represent these struggles in different names. Sometimes, in India, we have the classical instance of such struggles being characterized as sponsored by urban nexals and so on. So you have the same urban nexals in Africa and also in Latin America?
So yes, you have a very similar. I guess I can speak a little bit about my reporting in Mexico, where I'm reporting from indigenous communities like Adivasi communities here that are being targeted by the government of Mexico, by multinational companies, and by cartels, organized crime. So that these three groups, the government, companies, and cartels, they want indigenous land, which is resource rich. So they want, titanium, gold, steel. ArcelorMittal is one of the steel companies that was working in some of these areas that I'm reporting on. And the indigenous communities for hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years, have been protecting their land. And they're very biodiverse and very ecological rich right now. It's a very, very precious ecosystems that these communities have protected. But they're also natural resource rich. So the companies, governments want them sometimes, ironically, for this global green transition. We need lithium, we need titanium, which are supposedly going to help us preserve the same ecosystems that we're destroying in order to get these minerals. And so these communities, first they say no. Usually there's a legal battle. And then the cartels get involved. So the companies and the government somehow on the side, they contract or ally themselves or align their interests with cartels that then begin to attack the communities. And in some of the places that I'm reporting on, the communities, sometimes very small communities, 1,000 people. I guess this doesn't happen quite often in India, but these small communities, they purchase drones, they purchase anti-aircraft guns, and they fight back against the cartels. And so the cartel is bombing them and they're bombing the cartels. And they're fighting full-on wars that are not reported in Mexican media or international media. For questions, like we've said, of, historically these communities, indigenous communities, have been called in Mexican media or Mexican thinking as primitive, indigenous, primitive. They're not worth talking about. They have nothing to teach us. They're not important. And so their concerns, to the extent of even a war where their children are being killed, is not reported. And so in order to your question, in order to raise their profile, for example, at TED, when I spoke about this community fighting this drone war, if I call them indigenous communities, or if I call them simply indigenous communities who are fighting a war to protect their identity, their territory, who they are, that's not going to fly. That's not going to catch the attention of the international community. So the way to talk about them is to refer to them as environmental defenders. So they're defending the environment, they're defending the ecology, which is a trendy topic, which is something that the world is now interested in and trying to pay attention to. And the reason I went to Mexico was because in 2021, there was a report in Global Witness, an international research organization, which published a report stating that Mexico was the deadliest country for environmental defenders in the world. So in 2021, about 54 environmental defenders had been killed in that year. So I showed up and I began to report on these environmental defenders in these communities. But actually the issues are much more nuanced, much more complex, and more complete. The communities see their land and the ecology as part of their family. But trying to explain this to a Western audience is like you're fighting a losing battle. But if you present them as trying to protect the ecology, trying to protect jaguars on this mountain, which is full of gold, which is full of steel, or protect a coastal ecosystem where turtles are coming to nest, that captures the Western imagination and interest. And so as the media shifts, hopefully we'll have to do less of this. But every time you report on something and try to get into the global media, you're playing a game. You're trying to play a game for you're trying to figure out, how can I capture what's going on here? How can I tell the story? And I think for me, the analogy that I like to use sometimes is going back to Herodotus, the historian, Greek historian. He wrote about these 300 Spartans who fought a losing battle to protect, their Sparta, and they were fighting the Persians. That story in the Greek telling is full of colonialities. The Greeks were fighting for truth and reason, and the Persians came, they're savages, and they wanted to just take over with brute force. It's full of colonialities. But I think Herodotus, as the messenger, as the reporter, managed to tell that story in such a way that it's still being told today. We still recognize the bravery and the losing battle, the nobility of that battle that the Spartans fought. So in a similar way, I think I'm trying to tell the stories of these indigenous communities. They're very small, they're probably going to lose, and they're overpowered completely by very powerful cartels that are being financed and armed by the Mexican army, by US gun exporters. They're extremely wealthy and powerful. And these communities are taking on these incredibly powerful forces. So how can I tell the stories of these of these indigenous communities in a way that we remember and we recognize and we honor the battles that they're fighting. And one way to do that is to portray them as environmental defenders protecting the ecology, which we all share, which we all need, which we need to protect for the next generation of humans, for our children. So that's one way of, I take inspiration from Herodotus to see how we can tell these stories.
Thank you. I think we can make this interaction more participatory with a few questions from the audience. I think we have 10 minutes. Please be brief and your comments or questions like that. Please.
Sir, I would like to ask you on the blurring lines between who are the fighters, who are the patriots. The Hamas, to some media, it is their patriots. The other media, the Western media, they are terrorists. So what about the blurring line? Who define who is a fighter, who is a patriot, who is a terrorist? That is one of my questions, sir.
We will take all questions first and the answer should be together, okay? Please be brief.
Good afternoon. I actually had a question related to the Western media, specifically the US. So when you look
Please louder.
Hello? Yeah. When you look at the US media, if you look at the US government, what they've done over the past 30 years, if you look at what they've done in Nicaragua, if you look at what they've done in Iraq, Saddam Hussein, Libya, you see a trail of violence, yes. But however, when we look at the movies or the soft power that comes from US, which comes through Western media, you see them as heroes. You see so many movies like Olympus Has Fallen, so many things has fallen, and the US always comes on top. So my question is, do you not think that the Western media is basically using soft media power to, hide what the actual actions of the US is? And I also wanted to ask about, since you report from Congo, I actually wanted to ask about neo-imperialism in relation to the US in Congo, considering the fact that I remember that back in the 2010s, there was a multi-million project where the US state basically allotted a project to these private military contractors such as Blackwater and DynCorp, where they would go to the Congo and through hidden means and agendas, they would gather resources for the US. And I wanted to ask if you've ever reported on something like that, because I've been researching on it and I'm quite unable to find any sort of resources when it comes to that, neo-imperialism. I find so many on China, especially, in India, there are so many people, but there are hardly any resources that points towards the negative aspects of the US.
Yeah, can we expect a Palestinian state in the future? We are not going to see a Palestinian state in the near future. Okay, but the solution to everybody says that Israel-Palestine question is so complicated. It's not that complicated. Okay, it's a history. Everything else could be very, very complicated, multi-layered. But at the end of the day, the simple answer is that what is the solution? The solution is the creation of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state. When we say two-state solution, what we mean is the creation of a Palestinian state, because the state of Israel is there. They made it. 1948, the state of Israel has been created and it has international recognition. It is a UN member. But the Palestinian state is being promised. When? I mean, from 1947 onwards, the UN General Assembly resolution, and then 1978 Framework for Peace in the Middle East Agreement, 1993 First Oslo, 1995 Second Oslo, but you still don't have a Palestinian state. Not just that, the situation in Palestinian territories is becoming worse. Now, you must have seen President Trump's statement that he wants to own Gaza, clean out Gaza, which is a hellhole, a demolition site for him. And who made it a demolition site? That's the first question. He doesn't talk about it. And he wants to move the Palestinian people of Gaza, which is 2.3 million people, 23 lakh people. He wants to forcefully move them out of Gaza and then make Gaza a heaven on the Mediterranean coast. So, what we are witnessing now is the situation in Palestinian territories is becoming worse. But the long-term solution is simple. It is not that complicated. The long-term solution is the creation of a Palestinian state. Whether the international community will wake up to that, whether other regional actors will wake up to that, will Israel accept that reality? These are the questions that we are facing. And to answer your question, sir, yes, I think I have already explained while talking about the different narratives about Hamas. Yeah, it is it's like one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. It has always been like that. Bhagat Singh was a terrorist for the British. So you can always look at that, but generally what we can see is that, I mean, how do we define terrorism is the means these organizations are using. So if you want to reach a conclusion, make a technical definition, designate a group a terrorist organization, that can be done. So my point, larger point is that we have to look at the bigger picture. Because when the Israelis said that they wanted to destroy Hamas, the problem was that Hamas is not ISIS or Al-Qaeda. ISIS and Al-Qaeda are basically death cult. They wanted to kill. They wanted to spread their ideology through violence. But Hamas is part of the Palestinian society, irrespective of the violence they use. And they have a political goal. And the political goal is the liberation of Palestine. So the question here is that unless you address that political question, you are not going to destroy Hamas. It's as simple as that, which now IDF itself says. The IDF spokesperson said 3 months ago that Hamas cannot be destroyed. Right? So that's how we look at it.
So to your question about the Western neoliberal extraction of resources, yes, if you look at WikiLeaks, for example, there were cables between the ambassador and Washington, clearly stating that the situation, Eastern Congo and that territory is strategically important to the US because of its mineral resources. So there's huge reserves of coltan, which are used in cell phones. There's tin, which are used in circuit boards, and a range of other resources that we need for the global economy. So yes, there is a clear link between the conflict in this area and geopolitical interests and strategic interests, and the cables are very open about that. And why the media hasn't covered it is, yes, the media is biased, and I think, as I said before, I think countries like India, maybe China's a bit ahead in this, but countries like India need to recognize that the global information battlefield is a battlefield, and if we as long as we've let, as we have in the past, Western media organizations dominate the information flows, it's very surprising for information on, say, Cambodia to reach India. That information will need to go through London, from Cambodia to London or New York, and then come to India. That means there's a Western media, there's a Western filter, there's a Western editor who decides what's important, how it should be covered. And Cambodia and India are two countries with incredibly long histories and ties. Maybe there's some reporting, but generally the information will have to go this way. And same thing for Congo to Nigeria. So we need to break these flows, and we need information to flow directly. So Indian editors such as Stanley are more sort of directly involved in what is important about these countries, about Cambodia, what information should be covered, sending correspondence. Countries like India need to take a more active role in these kinds of information flows. And until India realizes that the media is of geopolitical and global strategic importance to India's goals and presence in the world, we're going to see problems like, as we see in the news today. And of course, Hollywood, we all know, maybe we all don't know, but Hollywood has very clearly been, used as a vehicle of soft power for US Army recruitment. Films like Top Gun or Independence Day, where the US saves the day, are very clearly used to project US power, to project US geopolitical goals, and to indoctrinate not only the US, but the global population. And so again, China's beginning to do this, but there's, I guess, the film industry or cultural industry is still laughing at China. They they portray Chinese films as sort of hubristic and propagandist, but the same is true for US media, except nobody's laughing at them. So I think as global power equalizes, people will stop laughing at China, and people will stop laughing at, Indian films. And you're seeing that slowly with RRR, in the Oscars. So you're starting to see the soft power shift and get respect as power balances shift around the world. So I think we're going to see more of that.
Thank you. We are winding up this session. So the fear today is that whether we are moving from many voices to one world, or from that to one voice and many worlds. I think with the Trump in place in Washington and Modi in place in New Delhi, and we have similar characters in different parts of the world, in Turkey, in Moscow, and in many places. I don't romanticize the media in Nobody can romanticize what is happening in the media in China or in Russia and other authoritarian systems. So we have to be very careful when you talk about the global south. It's not a romanticized, glorified version of everything, and you have the same mirror image of what is happening in the Western media happening in terms of suppression of news, in terms of distortion of news, and obstructing free flow of news and like that. And that's why that whenever our Prime Minister or somebody else talks about urban nexus, I think we are actually in the process of becoming one voice and many worlds or many people in this country and like that. Thank you very much. We haven't settled the issue here. I think nobody can settle the issue of this bias or distortion or the media divide, like digital divide and like that. Thank you very much. Thank you for each and all.